Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, 7 Lessons Learned from Nonprofit Leaders. For those of you who are returning grant space webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you who are here for the first time, I'm so glad you're joining us today. Special shout out to our 7 watch party locations that are Funding Information Network partners and locations across California. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Ganga Dharmapa, and I'm the Community Outreach Manager at Candid West, and I will be supporting today's webinar along with my colleague, Elizabeth Zavada. We will be managing polls as well as collecting questions that you ask along the way and posing them during the Q&A. And now I would like to turn the controls over to our presenter, Sean Kosofsky, so he can display his presentation. As he's taking the reins, I'll introduce him briefly. Sean has worked in the nonprofit sector for over 25 years, including as executive director for 4 organizations. He has led and raised millions of dollars for small and startup organizations, political organizations, and community initiatives. He offers coaching, consulting, and training through Mind the Gap Consulting, and he has worked on a range of issues, including LGBTQ equality issues, reproductive justice, voting access, bullying prevention, and more. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sean. Sean, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much to both of you and all of you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Excellent, excellent. So excited to be here today. Welcome to everyone who's joined online and the folks who are participating in libraries across California. I am also in San Francisco, California, so waving virtually to all of you. So we can dive right in. So I'm always excited to talk about issues of nonprofit management and leadership because I don't think we do a great job in the nonprofit sector training people to be leaders and executive directors of nonprofits. There's usually no manual. People just sort of are thrown into the deep end. And so I'm really passionate about talking about ways to avoid the mistakes that other folks have made so that they can have a very successful career leading a nonprofit. So the things we're going to talk about today are not just for executive directors, they're for any leaders, but I will interchangeably talk about EDs or executive directors throughout here because it's mostly tailored to those that are in an executive role in a nonprofit, but this is really applicable to anyone. So let's see here if I can get my controls. There we go. So there are many lessons to be learned from nonprofit executive directors and other leaders, and they certainly, and I have made plenty of mistakes over our careers, and we've had lots of successes. So I want to share some kernels of wisdom, and so that you don't make the same big mistakes or small mistakes, and that you have a lot of success also. A lot of what you're going to see here today in this presentation is my own learnings and things I have culled and learned from other executive directors around the country. I know many of them. We talk, we gossip, we learn from each other. So you're going to be seeing a lot of this stuff that really comes from not just my own perspective, but from industry and lots of different kinds of nonprofits, political, charitable, all over the country and beyond. The number one lesson to remember is to invest time developing relationships. So this slide says no board rapport, right? So not having board rapport is a major challenge or problem for any nonprofit leader. This may seem obvious, but building relationships with your board is really critical, and not doing so is a major blind spot. A big theme in this talk today is about partnership, that the executive director and the board should be partners in running the organization. Too often there's a power differential there, and people see it as the board is up here and the executive director works for them in a subservient role, but it's really more of a partnership, and it takes some discipline and some time to really wrap your head around the fact that these are really mutually supportive roles. So the partnership is a really key theme throughout all of this. The board technically owns the nonprofit, right? It is a not-for-profit corporation, at least in the United States. Boards own the nonprofit. They set the vision, they set the budget, and they hire and fire the executive director, but the executive director executes while helping and training the board and developing the board. So those two roles are very, very different, and it's really unique to our sector. One of the things when I talk about, I'm going to just veer off here for a quick second, because when I talk about partnerships among executive directors and boards, one thing that happens very regularly that isn't in my presentation, but I want to talk about for a second here, is executive session. So anyone here who's ever been on a board or has been an executive director, you know that there's this thing that some boards do at board meetings called executive session. And this is when everyone is sort of asked to leave the board meeting so that the board can talk among themselves. I've written about this. I have YouTube videos about this. I am not a fan of executive session at all. So when we talk about a partnership between the ED and the board, one of the things I'd encourage nonprofits to look at is getting rid of the practice of executive session. And it breeds mistrust when you ask the ED to leave the board meeting so that people can just talk about you. I'm a big believer that executive session is really about, should only be used if there's disciplinary action that needs to be used against the executive director, or when it comes time to evaluate the executive director's performance and their compensation. So I just wanted to get that out because I forgot to put it into the presentation, and it's something I feel very, very strongly about. So as a best practice, lesson learned, over time, executive directors and boards should build trust and have this partnership in a way that you don't need to excuse people out of the board meeting. Good things happen when the light shines in. Openness, transparency, everything should be happening in a partnership and in a conversation. So many ED, you'll see from this slide here, the first bullet, many EDs see boards as adversarial, and like the executive session thing I just talked about, that breeds more of that. So some people see boards as outsiders that are uninformed, untrained, and they see them as challenges to overcome instead of as allies. You might even say, well, but my board is horrible, or my board is dysfunctional, or I don't get along with so-and-so. You have to resist the temptation to avoid your board or not engage them or even write them off. It's hard, but this is the job as a nonprofit leader, to fully engage the board. Boards are also time consuming, and that's okay. Building rapport is time consuming. It's part of the most important work you can do in a nonprofit. Getting to know your board members, get to know your board members. Take them out individually for lunch. When they're all gathering for a board meeting, maybe that afternoon or that day, you spend individual time with each of them. Take them to coffee or lunch. Really have an authentic relationship with them. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable with your board. This is one of the hardest things for executive directors, because being an executive director can be really isolating. You have to be really strong to your staff and really strong to your board, and letting people know that you don't know everything or that you've made mistakes can be very vulnerable for executive directors. We'll talk about how to address that later. So be careful what you share, but in general, try to have authentic relationships with your board. You will thank me for it. You will build a stronger organization, and your own career will be better for it by investing a lot more time with your board. So alignment and trust. This is huge. Alignment is when every board member has a shared agreement on the mission, the goals, and how the organization is performing. It's even better if the board and the staff are all in alignment. You don't need everyone to agree on everything, but if anyone is rowing in the wrong direction, in that metaphor, or has conflicts of interest, or isn't bought into your strategic plan, it can impact your performance of the organization. Building board rapport helps to smooth over differences and helps you better explain why things are the way they are in the agency. Also, building trust will help you with your own job security. If you're leading a nonprofit organization, building trust with your board is going to help you individually. Trust comes with relationships and history. The world is littered with former executive directors, shattered careers, and regret because this one lesson was treated too lightly and people didn't invest more time building rapport with their board. I'm guilty of this myself. There have been organizations I've led where I invested more time in performance and results and probably neglected board relationships too much, and it came at a cost. So I'm warning folks, this is a doozy. So with every challenge or lesson that we talk about, we're going to talk about how to address them. So here's the solution on this issue about building rapport. Here are some specific things that you can do to build rapport. You can buddy up with your board members, as I mentioned earlier a little bit about building personal relationships with them, but meet regularly with the chair and support them in their role. we're going to include in the free resources that you get today a check-in template. I believe that chairs and executive directors should be meeting very regularly, about every 2 weeks, in person or by phone or virtually. And the goal is to keep ongoing communication and transparency. This builds trust. Keep 90% of the agenda the same every single time. So the chair and the ED can both agree on what things need to be covered regularly, so that when it comes time to have board meetings, the chair can say, oh, don't worry about it. On the ongoing stuff, the executive director and I are meeting regularly. Things are under control. But this check-in template that we're going to provide for you gives you an example of what you can have as a set agenda bi-weekly between the ED and the chair, and it's a powerful tool to help you in any leadership role at the agency, including if you're a board member. Once a year, you can adapt, or over time, you can adapt that check-in template to meet your needs. This is also a cover your butt sort of document, right? Over time, should something happen in the agency that causes a problem, you can say, hey, I've been meeting with the chair all along, and the chair can say, I've been meeting with the ED all along. It helps to kind of cover everyone's butt that they were doing due diligence to have these regular meetings and check-ins. It is a best practice. Also, seeking input into meeting agendas. In building rapport with your board, you will want to incorporate the input of different board members into your agenda. It can be tempting to just write the agenda as the executive director or just talk to your chair. But simply reaching out to board members occasionally, if not every single board meeting, to ask their input. What would you like to see on the agenda? Would you like to have a training at the end of the board meeting? Would you like to talk about X, Y, or Z? That personal touch matters. So even just calling your board members other than email a couple times a year to ask them their input goes a long way. Build a majority support for your votes. So there should be no surprises in a board meeting, especially if you're the leader of the organization. Votes should be planned, and you should know the outcome in advance. Of course, this isn't always the case, but if you want something to pass or fail at the board level, build your majority in advance. Be careful to not be too directive. If you're an executive director and it looks like you have an agenda and you're building people towards something you want, that does come with some risks. So be artful about it, be careful about it, but you don't want board meetings to turn into big debates and lost votes and misalignment. Always comes back to alignment. I'm a former lobbyist. I used to work in the public interest for civil rights organizations in Michigan, and 90% of the role of a lobbyist or a legislative educator is relationships and vote counting. So making sure that before something comes up for a vote, you've got all your ducks in a row. Always keep the board informed. Excuse me, in the way that they like to get information. Get clear on this. I've been serving in now my 5th executive director role, and every board is different. Some of them believe less is more. Some of them want more information than less. I personally love and don't mind email. I like getting more information than less. Even if they're just short emails, I can consume a lot of stuff and then move it along. But a lot of folks do not like that because they're busy and they have day jobs. But get clear with your board on how they want to get information. Do they just want it once a month before the board meeting? Do they want it more regularly? Getting clear on that is part of building that rapport with your board, and it establishes transparency and trust. Rapport and trust are not as important, they are as important as fundraising. So when you're thinking about raising funds for the organization, you should be thinking about rapport and trust as just as time consuming and just as important. Make time to meet and appreciate your board members. Notice things in their personal lives, like their pets and their kids, and keep up to date with them. Ask about that. The second to last bullet here is one called conocimiento. And I don't want to get this wrong, but my understanding of this term, and I think I'm right in this, there's no easy translation to English, but the term conocimiento means putting people before task. It means when you start talking with someone, or you sit down with them, or you begin a meeting, you talk about people issues and personal issues, and you get to know each other better before you dive into the actual task at hand. Conocimiento, this idea of putting people before task, is a fundamental thing that helps with building rapport. You will get a link to a video, a YouTube video that I put out about conocimiento in this leadership tactic, this leadership tool in the downloads. The highest performing executive directors invest in Rapport. There is evidence that executive directors that stay the longest and who are the happiest are not necessarily those with the greatest accomplishments. They're the ones who have the greatest trust with their board. So this is really important. Now, the second lesson learned is to just accept that fundraising is your job. Resist the temptation to hide behind excuses. Email, meetings, being busy, claiming that fundraising isn't your strength or trying to delegate it all isn't going to cut it. It is a convenient trap. This is some tough love. Put your big girl or big boy pants on and go get the money to go fund the work. It's very common for executive directors to make this mistake and feel like they can just push fundraising off on other people. And there's a myriad of excuses, and 95% of the time they just won't fly. Don't wholly delegate. You need to play a role in fundraising. You can delegate many fundraising tasks to other people if you're lucky enough to have other people, but meeting with foundations and major donors is all about the executive director. You can do so much more with more money, have an assistant, have more impact, have better benefits, the list goes on. So why would you not invest in trying to raise more money for your organization? And this will sound harsh, but if you don't fundraise and you don't want to fundraise at all, not a lot of people enjoy it, but if you won't fundraise, being an executive director or being a leader in the nonprofit might not be the right role for you. So just ask yourself that honestly. I also assume that you want people in your organization to do their job, right? So then you have to model good behavior. If folks don't see you fundraising, they won't want to put forward the effort either. Donors want to meet and know the executive director. This is just a key role of being an executive and being a leader in any nonprofit. So what do we do about this? If you aren't good at fundraising, learn it. Hire a consultant, get trained, lean on friends who are good at it. Make this a priority or a professional development goal. Also, as the executive director or as the leader of the organization, you should be the top fundraiser for your organization. What that means is that your board, staff, development director need to put you in positions to make the ask. Nonprofits are corporations. Can you think of any corporation where the leaders aren't expected to generate revenue? I can't think of anyone. I can't think of one company or corporation or not-for-profit corporation where revenue is not the responsibility of the higher-ups in the organization. Have people set up the meetings for you and then just go. You should be the best storyteller of your nonprofit, so have people set you up for success and go raise that money. Create the conditions for success. Make sure that your board and staff get training. Create a culture of asking across the nonprofit. Make sure that you have a great case statement. This goes a long way to getting everyone on the same page toward alignment. And have a great elevator pitch. Use the board worksheet that we're going to send to you, which is a really, really powerful tool to get your board on board. The board worksheet gives a list of things that you can hold your board accountable to. They get to choose the things throughout the year that they're going to do to raise money. This is one of my highest performing tools that I give away online, and you're going to get it free today just by being on this webinar. Don't wait for your development director or your board to invite you to pitch in. Ask everyone involved in fundraising, how can I help? Where am I needed? Be proactive. This is what you can do. So here's one that makes people really squeamish, being afraid to fire someone. The third lesson learned is to fire low performers, including staff, volunteers, and board members. We all want to be liked. I know we all want to be liked. It's a fundamental human desire. But being an executive director means that you were hired to get results, not to be liked. If you can do both, great. Many of us can, hopefully, but it's not what you were hired to do. If someone isn't performing, develop them or replace them. That sounds harsh, but it's what's needed. It's a hassle to replace someone, I totally know, but imagine what it would be like if you had a high performer in the role where you really right now have a low performer. Imagine all that could get done if you had a rock star in that role. Now, I'll confess, this one's hard for me. I am certainly not conflict averse. I have only fired one or two people in my entire life, but I know I've been in the room when other people were being terminated, and it's really challenging. It's really difficult. It is hard for many reasons. We make excuses. People work for very little. They're nice. What if I'm the problem as the boss? What if I'm actually not developing this person well? We make a lot of these excuses, but stop second guessing yourself. Work out a performance improvement plan if someone can't do the job. Be ready to replace them when that's needed. Many times the employee knows that they're not performing well or that the role is not a right fit. But just remember, you have a duty to the organization, your board, and your stakeholders to get results. You aren't doing justice to anyone involved in this nonprofit by keeping low performers on board. Again, tough love, it's difficult to hear. It's one of the hardest things I learned as a manager and executive director about a decade ago was that you do need to get rid of people in your organization that are not able to grow your organization and help you reach your mission. So it looks like we've reached our first poll of the webinars. I'm going to hand it back to Ganga for her to take control.
All right, thank you, Sean. So our first question, our poll question for the room, all of you should be able to see this on your screen. What are your feelings around firing staff? So if those of you are on the webinar today virtually, please select one of the following. I avoid it as much as possible. I'll do it, but I feel very uncomfortable. It's not a big deal. You do what has to be done. I haven't had to fire staff yet. Other, please specify in chat. All right, Elizabeth is going to go ahead and close the poll. And here's what we had. So for the virtual audience, it looks like 8% said, I'll avoid it as much as possible. And the majority of people said, I'll do it, but I feel really uncomfortable. So 38% said that. 30% said, I haven't had to fire staff yet. 14% said, it's not a big deal, you do what you have to do. And other, but it looks like, Sean, that most people said, I'll do it, but I feel very uncomfortable. And the second runner-up was, I haven't had to fire staff yet. So do you have any comments or responses to what people voted on?
Well, for the folks who are saying I haven't had to fire staff yet, part of me wonders whether they're just avoiding it. So part of me wants to know if there is someone who they believe is a low performer, but they haven't taken the step yet, or situations just resolved themselves, but they were in a position where they might need to. But we'll just tackle the top response here. I'll do it, but I feel very uncomfortable. This is very common. You might see things on TV or in our pop culture where people can just fire people very willy-nilly and easily. It's just not that easy, and it's just not that natural for a lot of people, especially if you're nonprofits and especially if you are drawn to this kind of work. It might be really difficult, partly because we're putting someone's livelihood and their income, at stake, right? That's a real concern. And also because we don't want to be perceived as someone who's not nice or anything like that. So this is just very, very common that people say it's uncomfortable. I'd be surprised if the top answer was, it's not a big deal, you do what has to be done. I think in the private sector, that number might be a little higher, but in our sector, this is not surprising at all. I will say that as challenging as it is, everyone needs to be on the lookout for not just egregious smoking gun style violations that their staff have, but just a slow drip of low performance. That's all you need to really put someone on a performance improvement plan or get someone in the right role.
Great. Thank you, Sean. So it looks like some of our viewing parties have responded. Santa Monica says the group is mostly aligned with, I haven't had to fire staff yet. And it looks like people are pretty much aligned with how the virtual audience voted. So thank you, Sean.
Thank you. Excellent. So make sure I've got control of here we go. So the solution to this is to build your own team, right? To build your team the way you want to build your team. Employees being fired should not be surprised that they're being fired. If any employee is clueless to the fact that they've had performance problems, then that's a failing of their manager. If you haven't been giving them regular feedback that their writing or their speaking or their job responsibilities are falling down, then that's on you. So it's really unfair to the worker to just fire them out of the blue. Some managers will say, oh no, they have to know. They have to know that their performance is is poor, but that's not necessarily true. If that employee was fired, you need to look at yourself as a manager and ask whether you were doing a good job supervising people. Again, a very challenging task. Not everyone can do that well, developing employees. There are many options for getting rid of an ineffective employee. You can, of course, fire them. You can coach them out by working with them so that they eventually leave or get them into some other role adjacent to the nonprofit. You can find a new role for them. If you hired someone who's not really great at digital media, but they're terrific at fundraising, maybe a role change could work. Usually if there's a low performance problem, shuffling them around is just like rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. Don't bother, this person is not going to succeed. But in general, if there is a role for that person in the agency, that is another way to move them to another role. You can also make them an independent contractor with a modified scope of work. You can also give them severance. Sometimes it just makes a nonprofit or any employer feel better to say, this isn't working out, but I want you to have a soft landing. We're going to give you 2 to 4 weeks to just kind of move on so you have a little bit of security. Or you can give them a long exit horizon. You can basically say, this isn't working out. We're going to find someone to replace you in the next 4 months. So you have 4 months to go find another role somewhere else, but this just isn't working for us. There's lots of different ways to move out a low performer that makes it easier than just giving an all-out firing. You have plenty of options. But a lot of folks also, I think, I know this is for me, I've only ever run really small organizations under $2 million budgets, and that the idea of having to hire another person is just so time consuming and such a hassle that sometimes you are reluctant to fire someone because you're like, oh, I have to do another search. One thing I learned years ago is that there are human resources professionals out there that you can just hire to run your search for you. It doesn't have to be an executive search firm. There are people that for as low as $2,500 will create the job posting, post it out in the world, and screen all the applicants and bring you the top 6 for as low as $2,500 or $3,000. There are people who will do that. So there's really an inexpensive way to farm out that part of the search and just bring you the top candidates for a certain role. You can also reduce the need to fire people by hiring better in the first place, by using a better screening tool. Interviews are the least helpful and most emotional part of hiring someone. People can interview really well and be a horrible worker, or people can interview poorly and be a great team member. So interviews can be really tricky. So you're going to want to do other things to make sure you're bringing on people the right way. Ask questions that really matter for the tasks that they're going to handle. There's no better indication of future behavior than past behavior. Ask people, what did you do in this situation? How did you behave when this happened? Finding out how people have actually performed before is critical, and it's an underused tool in the interview process. Go really deep on references. Don't just go through the motions. Ask candidates to do scenarios or exercises for things they're going to have to do in the role. So these are all tips for how to hire right in the first place. But also monitor your employees. Do check-ins. It's time consuming, but every 2 weeks, do a 30-minute check-in, look at the work that they're doing, make sure they're not going way out of control on some project or duplicating something someone else is doing. Check-ins serve a lot of really good needs. And do repeat backs. I love the Management Center, and in a second we're going to talk about a script that you can get from the Management Center. But repeat backs are these great tips and tools where every time you delegate or give a task to someone, you have them say it right back to you. This is just like what happens at Starbucks and lots of retailers. You make your order, they repeat the order right back to you to make sure that they heard it correctly. So these are all tips to make sure that your employees understand what was asked of them. Performance improvement. So one of the things you're going to get today is going to be a script from the Management Center, and all they do is help campaigns and nonprofits with hiring, firing, and management. So you're going to get a sample performance improvement script for how to put an employee through that. I love the tool. Go to the Management Center. All of their resources are free, but this one is relevant to this tip. So the fourth lesson learned is to say no more often. Saying yes all the time will burn you out and make you less strategic and less effective. Don't say yes too much to board members, donors, joining coalitions that you don't have time for. Learn how to explain that stretching yourself too thin is not good for the organization. So again, yes equals less of you. I have a big picture there with a do more crossed out. Resist the temptation to say yes and agree to everything. So here's the solution for this. Concrete things you can do to consider to learn this lesson. Do a few things well instead of 20 things poorly. I love this statement. I say this all the time. Whenever someone wants to pull me in a direction or into additional work that I can't do, I say I'm trying to do a few things well instead of 20 things poorly. This is a good strategy. As an executive director or as a leader of a nonprofit, you need to supervise people and tasks and collaborate with the board. Delegate what you can and focus on running the organization. Being agreeable all the time can be a trap. This is about going back to being liked. If you're the executive director, ask yourself, I'm the highest paid person in this organization, so is it really a good use of my time to be doing X, Y, or Z? Role play, practice saying no. You can find a coach or a buddy or even a board member to help you practice saying no. Seriously, this sounds silly, but you can role play different situations where you're asked to join a coalition or proofread the newsletter for the 4th time. It's empowering to set out your own workflow and your own terms. Role playing can be a powerful thing to practice a new skill. Make your strategic goals public so saying no is easier. One way to get better at saying no more regularly is by declaring to your staff or to your board what your strategic priorities are. Here are the 5 things I'm focused on this year. Anything else is a distraction. Do this out loud if you need to. Hold yourself accountable. Ask others to hold you accountable. Care less about being a people pleaser and be a people leader. Okay, this is critical. Pleasing people will not get you to a great employee review at the end of the year. You'll rock your annual review if you do this. Executive directors should have an annual review. If you're not getting an annual review right now, you should be getting one. I know it's like, oh, my board hasn't been giving me one, and that's okay because I don't like negative feedback. I understand the temptation, but if you want to grow, if you want to develop, if you want to be the best person, avoiding feedback is not the way to do it. Get an annual review. I was at a nonprofit once that avoided giving me a review for 4 years. I had blind spots the whole time that I didn't know about because my board would not give me a review. And when it came time for me to leave the organization, I got feedback that was really unfair because I didn't have time to fix it or address it while I was the leader of that organization. It just had to do with some cultural stuff in the organization, nothing big, but I would have loved to have addressed it if I had gotten an annual review as I asked for. Do what's in your job description. So saying no and to more things helps you focus on what's in your annual goals and in your job description. That's how you're going to be measured at the end of the year when it comes for your employee review. So just prioritize. Strike the right balance between being strategic and being insular. You don't have to engage, you are going to have to engage the larger world in your work, but organizations that are so focused on saying no that they never really leave their own walls or doors, they don't engage the larger community or coalitions, that's actually taking it to an extreme. So find the right balance. Fuzzy math. This is one of my favorite ones. The 5th lesson learned is to not get blindsided by a bad financial situation. This happens all the time. Some executive directors never check the financials before their first day. One executive director position that I accepted threw me for a total loop. I saw the financials when I accepted the offer in the summer of 2008, but by the time I started in the late summer, early fall, the organization had made some decisions that they hadn't told me about, and the organization I was asked to lead, which was in a strong financial position months earlier, was now having a financial emergency because as the ED, the board wasn't checking the financials for up to 3 months. So I really wish I had spent some time over that window of time between getting the offer and starting, looking at the financials more regularly, and I could have had more insight into the situation I was walking into. I'll never make that mistake again. Not monitoring the financials after you're hired. Anyone leading the organization, board chair, ED, whoever, just like fundraising, you need to be looking at the financials. Most folks don't like to read financial statements. They're intimidating. They're confusing. It's not sexy at all, but this is your job. You have to be pristine. You have to be perfectly clean as a nonprofit. And here's why. whenever you hear about some kind of like controversy or whistleblower or someone filing allegations against your nonprofit or a crisis, it's usually not the crisis or the bad PR that causes the problem that brings down that company or brings down that nonprofit. It's the financials. After someone takes a closer look at how the actual organization is being run, that's where you find problems and that's where you get into trouble. This happened with Enron. This happened with Acorn. You've had a lot of organizations that get into trouble. So when I say be pristine, I mean watch the financials monthly, make sure that all of your vendors are accurately billing you and that your employees are filling out expense reports accurately. Have pristine books. Forgetting to get oversight from the board is another big problem. It is in your best interest to have the board reviewing financials regularly too. If problems arise, you can always cover your butt by saying, hey, the whole board had the same information I had. You should have all seen that there was a financial challenge coming this summer when I showed this to you in March, April, and May. So it's important that you be looking at the books regularly and that you encourage the board to do the same. Just like asking for a review, you should be enforcing that the board do their due diligence and look at the financials. So focusing on the financials is one of the key parts of leading a nonprofit that nobody or very few people find exciting. So now we have reached our second poll, and I will hand over controls of the webinar.
All right, thank you, Sean. And I got a couple of questions in the chat just about sound. So they said your voice was cutting out just briefly, so just wanted to loop that in, but we can still hear you. So just wanted to let you know if there's something in the Wi-Fi, something to check out, but you sound great. All right, so this question is for the audience, poll question again. How comfortable do you feel speaking to the financial health of your organization? So those of you virtually who are there, feel free to vote now. I'm not comfortable at all. I avoid the topic when possible. I can speak to it broadly, but not about the specifics. I'm comfortable, but I'm sure there are areas I can improve, and I have no hesitation whatsoever. All right, so Sean, this is how people voted. It looks like a majority of people said, I'm comfortable, but I'm sure there are areas I can improve. So that's 46%. And then 29% said, I can speak to it broadly, but not about the specifics. And then the third most highest response was, I have no hesitation whatsoever. And then divided between 3 and 2%, I'm not comfortable at all, and I avoid the topic when possible. And we had a response from our virtual viewing party in a couple of locations. So Santa Barbara Public Library said, at Santa Barbara Public Library, we agreed I can speak to it broadly, but not about the specifics. Solano Community Foundation in Fairfield said, 50% are comfortable, but know there are areas to improve, and 50% have no hesitation. So that's a little bit different than the virtual audience. And then in Santa Monica, most of people said, I'm comfortable, but I'm not sure there are areas, I can improve. So Sean, any thoughts about what the virtual audience said and the in-person watch parties said?
It's not much of a surprise. Actually, I'm going to go off my headset and work without the headset for a second to see if people can hear me better for the delay, folks. So let me know if this is not working. Is this okay or better for folks that were thinking that there was a problem?
Yes. So many people are saying, yes, better. Great,
okay,
you sound great.
I will get rid of the headset, which I thought would be better, but I will speak without it and run the risk of an echo. Okay, so these results are not much different for me than what I was expecting, but it's amazing to me that if you ask almost anyone, do you have any hesitation at all explaining your programs? I bet you'd get 90% saying, I have no hesitation whatsoever. But the very money coming in and money going out, only 20% say that. We need to get more business acumen and financial acumen into our nonprofits. I remember the first executive director job that I was offered, I had never really looked at financials before, and I knew that the temptation would be to linger and stick and want to work on programs, but what I was hired to do was fundraising, management, and finance. Risk aversion for the organization, right? So no surprises in these numbers, but I would love for the sector to get that 20% up to 90%, and everyone has the control internally to do that. We're going to talk about a tip on how to get there in the next slide.
All right. Thank you so much, Sean.
All right. So the solution here. Here are some concrete steps you can take to learn this lesson. If you need help understanding financial statements, ask for help. Ask someone on your board. Probably a lot of people are struggling with it and they're afraid to admit it. So just go for it and ask. Engage someone on your board or a CPA or a local nonprofit association for help. You can also hire Fun with Financials. This is a small company based here in San Francisco, and they help nonprofits with learning finance and doing better by their financials. It's a terrific little company, and they help nonprofits. Make sure you're looking at the income statement, the balance statement, and the cash flow. You don't have to look at every single thing every single month. In fact, many months, I don't always look at the balance statement if I've got lots of cash on hand, and I just look at the income statement and the cash flow. The first time I really started using a cash flow document, it changed my life because I could see into the future when we were going to go broke. I don't know of an executive director out there who isn't at a very well-financed organization that isn't constantly worried about the day you go broke, right? Like how much money is in the bank? At what point are we in trouble? So cash flow documents, having a constant ongoing knowledge of when you're going to run out of money and just always worried about pushing that number into the future so that you never go broke. But cash flow statements can be super powerful and they can give you confidence. Making sure you're looking at those statements is really valuable. I always let my staff know that I review expense reports and receipts. So it doesn't always happen every month, but my staff always knows if you try submitting an expense report with a huge expenditure that we didn't approve, or 5 nights in a hotel and we could skip that through when the conference was only 3 nights, now it doesn't really ever happen. But simply by telling your staff that you're going to look at each expense report and each receipt every now and then keeps people above board. It keeps them not fudging numbers. It keeps people honest. So it's time consuming, but every now and then just let people know that you are doing that due diligence. Also, don't assume that there isn't fraud in your nonprofit. Don't assume that audits will catch fraud. They regularly don't. Audits are not designed to catch fraud. They're designed to look at systems. So it's not uncommon for someone to create a fake invoice or other problems in the organization, and it just goes months or even years without people realizing it. So pay attention to every element of the way financials work. Also, huge one here. Do not conceal cash flow problems. This is huge. I can't tell you how many executive directors I know who are scared or embarrassed to tell their board that they didn't see a shortfall coming, or they saw the cash flow problem coming and decided to go without a paycheck or 3 in order to ensure that the agency or the staff are protected. That may be generous. It may sound generous to say, oh, we're going to have a month where there's no money in the bank account, so I'll just go without pay so everyone else can get paid, but I won't tell the board because it's why bother? I don't want to freak everyone out. You can't do that. Lying about your financial health of your organization to its owners, the board, can get you fired or worse, and I have seen it happen. So this is what Enron did. This is what some people did. Lying to investors, lying to stakeholders about the financial health of your nonprofit is not smart. Don't do it. Ask for help. I cannot stress this enough. That's why it's in yellow. Don't do it. So the next one, the 6th lesson learned, we're wrapping up soon because there's 7 of these today. The 6th lesson learned is to get clarity from the board about expectations, roles, and the division of labor. I can't tell you how often an ED just starts or a leader just starts in the organization and doesn't carve up these things. Your board has maybe 8 to 12 people on it. Are they all your boss? No, make sure to get clear on who your day-to-day supervisor is. It should only be one person. Normally this is the board chair, but sometimes it's someone with management or HR expertise on the board. If you can even pick your own board supervisor, choose wisely. This is vital to your career and to the organization and to reduce friction. Not getting clarity on roles leads to conflict, conflicting priorities, confusion, hurt feelings, and even low morale. So getting clear on this is important. Staff should not report to the board. This should not be happening. The executive director alone reports to the board. There are exceptions to this, maybe in 2% of nonprofits that are super flat or super local or don't have staff. But in general, the ED reports to the board and the staff report to the ED, to the executive director. This is how things need to work. But if the staff are reporting to different board members, that is a people not getting in their own lane challenge. So one of the handouts you're going to get today is this handy tool. Oops, we're not going to go there yet. We're going to see this, an image of this in a second before we get to the poll, but you're going to get a handy infographic that I designed called Get in Your Lane, which shows what every single person in the organization needs to be doing so that you can get clear on roles. I've used this with clients and I've used this with other nonprofits, and hopefully it'll be helpful for you. So we are up now to the third and I think final poll.
Thank you, Sean. So our third and final poll. Do you know who your supervisor is? This is a great question. Yes, I do. I should only have one, ... I have several. I am the supervisor. So go ahead and vote. So it looks like 74% said, yes, I do, which is great. 7% said, I should only have one, question mark. 5% said I have several, and 14% said I am the supervisor. And it looks like the watch parties are aligned with the most number of responses, and yes, I do. So Fresno and Santa Monica have responded, yes, I do. There was actually a question from Fresno. Is it normal practice for the board to ask for evaluations from staff? So we'll hang on to that question, Britt, and we'll ask that in the Q&A section, but thanks for asking it. So Sean, any thoughts, responses?
I'm actually delighted by these results. I think that having only 7 people saying I should only have one is actually great. That shows we've got sophisticated nonprofits on this webinar. I would have expected that to be about 20%. And so that's really surprising. It's great to see that 74% of people know exactly who their supervisor is. So this is great.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you.
All right, so now here is that great infographic. It's adorable, I know. I'm very proud of this infographic. It's 2 pages, it's a PDF. You'll get this as part of your package of files today. But the second page of this goes into other roles in the organization. But the Get in Your Lane document is really about giving out really clear avenues for who should be in what lane. And you can use this as a tool to tell other people, get out of my lane, I'm in your lane, you're in my lane, this is confusing. So this will be a great tool you can use later. All right, so now how to address this. Here are some concrete things you can do to learn this lesson or to utilize this lesson. Get in writing who your supervisor is for things like delegation and your annual review. You must advocate for yourself when this comes up, because you may only get one shot to pick who your supervisor is with your board.
Oh,
this webinar
Sean, Sean, I'm going to interrupt you just for a second. So we got some questions in the chat saying that we can't see your screen. We still see the poll up. So yeah, sorry about that. So thank you so much, Elizabeth. So and people really wanted to see that cute infographic. So if we can go back to that slide. All right, we can see your screen.
Excellent. So here's the cute infographic with little people in lanes. So you guys will get this infographic sent to you. It's a PDF in 2 pages. So you guys will get this later, but it clearly shows what each role does in the organization, and it's for people to stay in their own lane. All right, now I'm going to advance. So being able to pick your own boss, getting in writing who your supervisor is, like for things like delegation and your annual review. This webinar is about helping you as much as it is about helping the organization in terms of deciding these things. Get clear on decision-making authority. Now, this gets some executive directors in trouble, right? Put in your contract or your job description these things. You should know whether you have the authority to sign on to public statements that other organizations ask you to sign on to. Can you join coalitions without asking the board? Can you take positions on legislation or talk to the media? Get all these things set up in advance so that you know and you don't trip over something and then anger your board. So getting alignment on that is critical. Getting clarity about how the board works with staff. You should not be surprised that board members are assigning tasks to the staff, or the board members are socializing in a way with your staff that's inappropriate, dating, gossiping, anything like that at all. So having clear expectations of your board. Listen, no one on the board should be assigning tasks or asking things of my staff. If you have something that you want to ask the staff to do, please send it through me to the staff or CC me so I can see and approve it. But you should not be having all sorts of people asking all sorts of other people in the organization to do things. That's not a best practice. So now we're going to go to the last lesson. This one is my favorite because it's one of the most surprising and difficult for people to achieve, but it's really important. Not getting an employment contract. The single biggest mistake that executive directors make is to neglect protecting their job and their income. I have had multiple organizations resist giving me a contract, but after I had the offer in writing for the position, I insisted on it and they agreed. I've even had organizations say, no one here has a contract. And I said, well, now someone's going to because I'm insisting on it. An employer should not be frightened by giving an executive director a contract because as long as they don't behave badly, the employer, it won't be needed. An employment contract spells out that if you're ever fired without cause, which the organization can still do, they can still have the right to fire you even if you did nothing wrong. But if they take that option, they're going to pay you out. They're going to pay you out for the rest of the year. So there are consequences to having the freedom of just terminating someone without cause. I think most workers should actually have a contract. I think most people should have the protection that they can't be fired willy-nilly at will. So executive directors certainly should be getting an employment contract. You are vulnerable in this role because all of your bosses are volunteers who don't really work there. There's lots of other reasons. You have to be the one to take the fall if something embarrassing happens. There's all sorts of reasons for this. I mentioned at the top here that you will be getting an employment contract in your packet. So this cost me hundreds of dollars to work with a lawyer to write up an employment contract that can work for most people around the country. So you will get a free employment contract. It is very, very pro-worker. So most employment contracts are not very pro-executive director like the one I drew up, but the point of it was to show you all of the different things that an executive director could ask for or could insist on. So when you get that employment contract, just know that it's pretty bold. It's pretty gutsy to ask for everything that's in there, but you can pare back stuff from there. But I wanted to give people a very pro-worker contract, not a pro-management contract. All right, so the solution here is to get it in writing, get that employment contract. The way to protect your career is to go get this. So there are lots of protections included in an employment contract. You can use the one I've got and adapt it. It includes things like severance. It includes things like your benefits. What happens if the organization closes, moves, or changes your job responsibilities? I just saw a nonprofit bring in a new CEO even though they had an executive director already. The executive director was like, what was I hired for if now you're bringing in a CEO? And because they materially changed his job responsibilities, he had no protections to leave or walk out. This happens all the time. Get an employment contract, use the one I'm sending you, work with a lawyer in your state to adopt it. Don't sue me later because the contract wasn't absolutely perfect in your state. Use the one I give you, talk to a lawyer, use it to protect yourself. So that's really it. That's the end of the 7 lessons that I think are vital for nonprofit leaders to know. There are many more, but these are the most important that I see people continually messing up on. So that's the end of the presentation, and I think we're going to move to questions and answers.
All right. Thank you, Sean. So I'm going to pose the first question for you, and as you consider your response, I'm going to kind of talk about some upcoming events and things that can be of interest to our audience. So this is actually a question from our in-person watch party at Cal State University, Fresno, from Britt Foster. And the question for you, Sean, is it normal practice for the board to ask for evaluations from the staff? So is that normal practice, or any thoughts on that? And as you consider that, sorry, I'm going to pause for a second to give you a moment to consider that, to prepare your thoughts, and then I'm just going to highlight some things to expect in the future. So I'll just quickly run through. For those of you in the virtual audience, we want to invite you to our next webinar. That's going to be on Preparedness to recovery, fundraising for natural disasters. That's going to be on May 15th. And if you are in the Funding Information Network world and you're hosting a watch party, we invite you to host another one. If you would like to connect with an in-person audience next time, if you want to go to one of those locations, check out the May 15th webinar and also watch parties that will be accompanying that. And as always, Candid offers many proposal writing boot camps across the country. We have in-person sessions coming up in San Francisco. So if you're in San Francisco, we have a proposal writing boot camp for getting your development house in order and also getting ready with those proposals to submit to funders in March. We're also in Cleveland and DC, so check those out. So I'm going to hand it back over to you, Sean, regarding the question from Fresno. What are your thoughts on that first question?
So this is really tricky because I don't really know that there's anything that's normal or abnormal about that process, but I will say that I think even more so in flat structures or nonprofit organizations, wanting to make sure that people feel heard is even more commonplace. So it is not terrifically uncommon for the board to reach out to stakeholders in the community, maybe one or two staff people, to get a full picture of how the executive director is performing. Now, what I would do if I were the executive director is I would get clear on that from the beginning. What will my reviews look like? Who are you going to seek input from? If you're going to go to my staff, let's work on a process together so that it does not undermine me or feel like you're looking for gossip or dirt on me. It's not uncommon to do a 360 where you get input from people above you, next to you, and below you in the organizational structure. But in general, most executive directors, when they are getting a review from their board, they are just sitting down with the chair or the supervisor or an HR committee of the board, and they're going through the accomplishments as measured against their job description. That's mostly what's happening. I've been in nonprofits where the staff have had their input solicited, but I would just be really careful to make sure you get clear with the board that staff opinions are not weighted the same way that the board and ED roles are. There's just all sorts of complexity with getting inputs from people that you are supervising versus the people who are supervising you. It should be an extra data point if they want to do it, but it should not be given the same weight at all. I believe. All nonprofits are different. There are going to be exceptions to this rule. If you're super flat as an organization, then maybe this works more, but I don't know anything about normal, but I know that I would be really clear with my board about what that staff input looks like.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean. So this question is from Judy. How does the conversation around only having one supervisor apply to an organization that's fully volunteer run? So there are no paid staff at all.
If there's no paid staff at all, then is anyone having a supervisor at all? So if there is an executive director for that nonprofit who is unpaid, then that's still a job and it's still a job description and they still need to have one supervisor, I believe. If you're paid or unpaid, if you have an executive director, it's only fair to that person to have one boss. No one should have two bosses or more. If the organization has decided that it makes decisions by consensus, or it rotates the role of executive director, or it's a council, then you should set out things clearly. What I don't like seeing happen in a nonprofit is for there to be multiple bosses for one person. So you either have a full committee deciding things or like a full group deciding things together, but if there's one person or co-chairs that have been appointed to run an organization, there should be one supervisor. Again, there are exceptions, maybe less than 10% of all nonprofits that are super flat or they're unpaid, where you might have an alternative structure, but I strongly advise against having two supervisors.
Got it. Great advice. And this question is from Raymond. Is there ever a time when the board should meet without the executive director?
I do not believe it is good practice for an ED and a board who are partners in running the nonprofit to make a standard practice of having executive session. I feel very strongly about this as a 5-time executive director. Most of the high-performing executive directors that I know of big organizations around the country have eliminated executive session altogether. The only 2 exceptions, and I know I'm an anomaly in this front, but I'm telling you, I've been both on boards and as an executive director and in nonprofits for 26 years, and this is a pain point for me. The only 2 times a year that a board should be asking everyone to leave the room is when the executive director's discipline is being discussed. So the ED has maybe done something that is bad and the board needs to talk about it in a way that can't be talked about with the board, with the executive director there. Most of the time the ED should be right there in the room. And if people are conflict averse or they're not comfortable talking about difficult topics, then they need training. But if my executive director did something wrong, I want them in the same room so we can talk to them and ask questions and establish some rapport. No one knows more about the organization than the ED. No one knows more about the day-to-day than the ED. So every time you remove them from the room, you are removing information, and that's not good. So, but the only 2 times I think they're okay is if disciplinary action has to be discussed, or when it's time to discuss that executive director's review and new compensation package for the next year. That at most would be once or twice a year.
Great answer. Thank you for considering that. All right, this question is from Tanya. It's a little bit of a longer question, but I've recently been asked to serve as a board advisor for a local nonprofit, and also the executive director is the nonprofit founder and serves as a board president. I see that as a conflict of interest. Is that legal?
For the board founder to also be the board president?
So the board founder is the executive director, board president, and yes.
So I will say that 20% of nonprofits out there have a model where the executive director is essentially the chair and CEO. So most nonprofits don't use this model. 80% of nonprofits use an executive director model who does not sit on the board. So the language this person submitted sounds a little tricky, but essentially 20% of nonprofits do have the executive director serving as CEO, which means they are both the executive of the nonprofit and they have a seat on the board, and might even be chair of the board. But they usually don't vote. So when that person is on the board, they only break ties or rarely vote at all. And that's usually the catch, right? So that's about an 80-20 split. But if someone is the executive director and the chair of the board and they're the founder, that is messy. It is not advised. I think that you will have problems with checks and balances and problems with transparency and board loyalty to the founder, who's also the person running it. There needs to be some kind of system to check that. So I'm not excited about that model, but I'd have to know more.
Great. Thank you. So this is kind of a follow-up question from JFK University, the Sanford Institute of Philanthropy in Pleasant Hill, one of our watch parties. Follow up to that question, just to clarify. So do you think the ED CEO can oversee the board instead of the other way around, where the board oversees the executive director? Is that possible? That's been a question that came up in their watch party.
No.
No.
So the board owns the nonprofit. They are, at the end of the day, the board is accountable to the state. If the board doesn't pay its staff, the Attorney General's office comes after the board. If the board acts with negligence, the board gets sued, not the executive director, typically. So the board owns the organization. This is structural, this is legal, this is standard. The board, in many situations, takes guidance from the executive director. Almost every nonprofit I've been in, because they're smaller or younger or newer, my board shows me a tremendous amount of deference, and it almost feels like I'm leading the board, but I do not supervise them. I don't give them annual reviews. When I say a partnership, and I said at the beginning that this whole thing is about a partnership, the power balance should be almost equal in terms of daily operations. The board and the staff, The board and the executive director need to be in constant communication, helping each other, supporting each other, and governing and executing together. But the ED should not be supervising the board. And where you see problems in nonprofits is when the board shows so much deference to the executive director that the ED might say something like, I think you're a bad board member. You need to get out of here. You need to roll off the board. I've seen board members actually take that from their executive director. That's not how things are supposed to work. The board supervises the ED. Ideally, you're working in partnership, but I've not really seen a model where the ED is supervising the board like they are employees or volunteers that are taking direction from a czar. You know, that sounds like a czar kind of situation, and that's not how nonprofits operate. A board lawyer or any expert in nonprofits will tell you that that sets up the organization for some risk.
Got it. Thank you. That's really good clarification, Sean. Thank you. All right. So this question is from Anonymous, and actually it came up a few times from different folks. So we pose it as one question. So what is your general advice for development or grants managers who are in an agency where the executive directors do not actually focus on a fundraising aspect for the board? So there are famous names on the board, but they're not actually helping development or grants managers successfully do their job. What's your advice on that when the board is not actually able to help and support the fundraising initiatives of staff?
So unless you're a foundation that's giving away money, most nonprofits need to raise money. This is structurally and legally required. All corporations are responsible for revenue, even not-for-profit corporations. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the board might not, so the board needs to be responsible for revenue. But the problem is a lot of boards were brought on and they were told they don't have to. So then you've got a misalignment problem, which we talked about earlier. So if I have come into nonprofits before where the entire board was not told at all that they had fundraising responsibilities, they were brought on for skills or for diversity, or they were brought on for some other reason, or because they're famous. But the role of an executive director is to, if you actually do need to fundraise, is to change that, to not have that board be your board. Over time, cycle those people out and put ones on that are going to fundraise. That sounds like a board that should be your advisory board. People that are loosely connected to the organization, they're not governing it, but they're lending their name to you and you're lending your name to them. That sounds more of an advisory board. If your board is not helping with fundraising whatsoever, and many do not, and it's a problem. It's one of the structural failings of our sector is that boards aren't trained or encouraged to fundraise. That's a real problem, and I would try to work on that. But it really does come from the board and the executive director getting on the same page. If you're in development in a nonprofit and your board isn't helping, there's not much you can do other than changing your executive director's approach and your board chair's approach.
Got it. Thank you. And it seems like that's a common issue for those on the webinar today. So this question is from Raymond, and it's kind of a philosophical question based on your experience and body of work. What is the best way to keep high morale when you do have to let a staff go? What are some strategies for supporting the team and keeping that morale up?
So I think staff, I'm a consultant friend of mine out here in the Bay said this line once, and I mentioned it earlier, but I love it. Good things don't grow in the dark, right? Good things grow in the light. Now, of course, people who love mushrooms or other things are going to disagree with me, right? But 99% of the time, good things grow in the light. Transparency, light, honesty. Good things happen when you're open. So when it's time to remove a staff person from an organization, you can be very clear. Meet with the staff one-on-one, or I wouldn't do it through an email or as a group conversation and be like, hello, everyone. Just want you to know Friday is going to be Sally's last day. It didn't work out in her role here. But if you have any questions, come see me or come talk to me. But keeping things secret or trying to be slick about it or trying to conceal things, it's not really going to work. You don't want gossip. You don't want people having wrong information. And when you don't have information out there, people fill it with their own worries or their own fears or their own morale problems, right? So in general, I wouldn't downplay it. I would just be crystal clear, beat everyone to the punch and say, here's what staff changes are happening here in the nonprofit. If you have any questions, please ask us. That's how I would handle it. And usually that can help address morale because people like openness and honesty, and just be clear.
Great. It's really good advice. Thank you. And this question that came up a few times, this is from Barbara. How does an ED actually let a board member go, for instance, if they are not meeting their fundraising goals or if it's not a good fit? What is best practice on asking them to step down?
So one of the tools that I don't think in the tools that I'm giving out today that folks are going to get this tool, but the most powerful tool you can get for helping to remove a board member is a board agreement. Elizabeth or anyone who's controlling the webinar, can I drop in a link for something for folks?
Yes, yep, you can. You can send that in the chat and Elizabeth will post it before the webinar ends.
All right, for some reason my mouse is not letting me go over to the thing. Whatever. I will make sure people get a link to this. I have, if you go to learn.mindthegapconsulting.org, there's no www in this at all, but if you go to learn.mindthegapconsulting.org, I have courses. And one of my courses is dirt cheap. It's like $20 or something, and it's basically how to create a board agreement in your organization. And I give you a sample free board agreement. I don't think it's going to come in your packet today, but you can certainly get one of these from me. A board agreement is powerful. It is one of the most important tools in a nonprofit. And a board agreement is essentially an MOU or a contract. When any new board member comes onto the organization, you use a board agreement to hold them accountable. They hold the organization accountable, you hold them accountable. The basic elements of a board agreement are, hey, board member, you have to agree to have really good attendance. You have to agree to read the materials and do the work of the committee. You also have to fundraise at some level, and we're going to come to some agreement about that level. And you also have to avoid self-dealing and conflicts of interest. Basically, that's what a board agreement says. And then in return, the nonprofit will give you insurance, directors and officers liability insurance. We promise to give you information when you request it. We promise to be honest with you. So a board agreement is a tool that you have your board sign every year. And if they are not adhering to the terms of that board agreement, it gives you and your chair a tool to say, hey, Jack, you've missed half the meetings, you're not reading the materials. Do you think this is the right fit for you? Or might you not be ready for board service? Do you want to roll into another volunteer role? Because this requires a much higher capacity of someone at this organization. Having that difficult conversation becomes 1,000% easier if you have a board agreement that that person signed that they're violating. So I would strongly encourage you to use a board agreement. I can give you a free one. There is another way if you email me after this to just give you the agreement. But if you want to take the course, again, it's like $20 and it walks you through all of the elements, how to do it and why it's useful. But that is the best way to remove a bad board member.
Excellent. And we have put that link in the chat there. So that's learn.mindthegapconsulting.org if you're interested in that. And this connects to one of our questions from a viewing party in Pasadena. Question from Melvin. I think this is kind of connected, but just wanted to run it by you. What is your advice for recruiting those board members that can effectively fundraise? Is it through the board agreement?
Yes. So people are always like, oh no, we need someone for our board because because they represent some diversity, or because they represent a big company, or because they represent geographic diversity. People and because they fit this need and we need them, we shouldn't be asking them to fundraise. That is garbage. I tend to speak bluntly, so I hope people are okay with that. That's just garbage. When you are recruiting people for your board, you need them to fundraise. When board members say things like, oh, I give of my time, well, that's great. When the bills come, I can't pay for things with your time. I need money. So you need to raise money. You need to join my board, and you are an owner. You are an owner. You're not a normal volunteer. By being an owner, you are responsible for revenue. So when I bring someone onto a board, I walk through the board agreement. Should you come onto our board, you need to be making 75% of all the meetings or better. You need to be reading all of the stuff we send you. You have to be informed before votes. You cannot have a conflict of interest or self-deal. You must also be help the board raise 20% of the budget this year. Those are the things that are spelled out. And sometimes on the fundraising one, people are like, oh yeah, that sounds easy, but then they don't do it. So you need to be really crystal clear on the fundraising part of a board agreement and say, are you clear that you might have to be asked to leave the board if you fall down on this responsibility? Just again, clarity, let the sunshine in, be crystal clear with people. But that board agreement is such a powerful tool. It helps with recruitment and it helps with removal.
Got it. Great. And how often should the board look at the financials? This is a question from Barbara.
So I think the full board should review financials. It all depends on the organization. If you're getting big government contracts, you probably need to look at more regularly. But in general, I've talked to some CPAs and some lawyers about this over the years. The full board could look at them every 3 months if you have a finance committee looking at it monthly. Someone needs to be looking at the financials monthly. So if there's a finance committee, great, have them look at the financials monthly. If you don't have a finance committee, get one and get a CPA with nonprofit GAAP experience. It's really important that you have a CPA or someone with nonprofit GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, expertise or experience on your board. So on your finance committee or on your board, again, someone can be on your finance committee and not be on your board. That committee be looking at your financials once a month, so that the board only needs to once every 3 months. But going anything more than 3 months without showing the board the books and the financials and encouraging them to review them, I think is starting to get close to negligence. You really need to have the board way more hands-on, at least encouraging them to look at it.
Got it. Thank you, Sean. So this question, and we're going to ask this anonymously upon the request of the asker, and it came up a few times. What is your advice for mid-level development managers? And there are a lot of development staff here on this webinar today who have a non-active board. So the board is not active and is not really fundraising, and the executive director is not really doing their job in terms of strategic planning, budget allocation issues. What is that development manager to do when they can't go to the board or the executive director?
So this is really tricky, right? So there's 2 avenues to address this. Either deal with it, right? Like, okay, this is my lot in life. I'm in a nonprofit where I have a board that's just not going to fundraise and an ED who's not going to press the point. So I'm just going to have to work around this reality. Many of us end up in organizations, families, relationships, whatever, with a thing you just can't solve or fix. So you just decide to work around it in some interesting ways. I've certainly fundraised a lot despite my board instead of with the help of my board. So you can do it, right? So you can just do nothing and just do your job and do the best you possibly can given the limitations. The other avenue is a little riskier, which is trying to change the way things are. So if you feel too vulnerable to talk to your ED or to your board about fundraising, then you might ask someone higher up in the nonprofit to carry that torch for you. But if you don't feel that vulnerable and you feel like you can actually have a frank conversation with your ED or leadership of the nonprofit, sit down with them and say, hey, everything we want to do here, more impact, more people served, bigger events, like everything we want to do takes more money. There's nothing we can't achieve that doesn't come down to raising more money. And I feel like we're all sort of like not able to achieve everything we want to achieve in this nonprofit because the board isn't helping. What can we do to get the board involved? One of my clients right now has a board that really is resistant to fundraising. They were built in a way that they were told they didn't have to fundraise. This nonprofit gets lots of government money, so they're just like, no, we're not going to fundraise. But I sat down as a consultant in that board meeting knowing that there was going to be incredible resistance to me saying you all have to fundraise. By the end of that meeting, they took that board fundraising worksheet and all of them filled it out and they are all working that worksheet. So you never know. You sometimes will get a board who's like told, you have an obligation. You're the owners. You, under the law, have to resource the budget that you pass. If a board passes a budget saying we're going to raise this and spend this, but does nothing to help, that's actually sort of negligence in my mind. A board has to resource a budget when they pass that budget. So there are ways to talk to your ED about the legal obligations that a board has to fundraise that helps move that conversation along. But it does take some gumption. It does take some gutsy language to sit down and say, this is what I want for this nonprofit. Don't you want this too? Let's develop this board.
That's a great answer. Thank you for addressing. I know that's a tricky question. So we have about 4 minutes left and a few more questions. Does that work for you, Sean?
Sure, I'll just try to move faster on the answers.
No, those are great answers. So this question is just to kind of expand on something you mentioned before, a phrase you mentioned this is from Dara. Can you expand upon the phrase of nonprofit funding gap?
Nonprofit funding gap. I don't remember saying that exact term, but I can say nonprofit funding gap. So what that sounds like it might be referencing is that there's a gap between the money you think is coming in. I think this might be a cash flow question. I'm not sure if I said this.
I think it is connected to a cash flow conversation.
Yeah. So if you're looking at the books and you have a grant that you're expecting to come in for 200,000 or 500,000 in August, but you're starting to run low on money in May, there's going to be a 3-month gap there where you have no money on hand to pay your bills. So that gap that happens in that window of time, nonprofits have a couple tools they can use to bridge that gap. They can cut all expenses that are discretionary. They can take out a line of credit. You should do this in advance. You shouldn't be doing this right when you're in a crisis, but having a credit card or having a line of credit so that you can always float in a 90-day or less emergency. Or you can go to the board and say, we're having a 3-month cash flow thing. We're not hurting on money. It's just a cash flow gap, right? So can you help us bridge this and we'll pay you back or whatever. Now, board loans are tricky, but there are ways to do this. But that's what I may have intended to describe when I mentioned the gap.
Got it. All right. Thank you for that. So our last question, and this is a question from Fairfield. Many people want to sit on a board because they want to do good in the community, but it can be really overwhelming, especially when there's expectation to give when there aren't that many resources. So what are just some basic ways that you can recruit board members and say, hey, this is how you could potentially fundraise without giving very large amounts or having a lot of experience, but they have the passion, they want to sit on the board. Are there any last tips you have for the group here?
Yeah, so one of the tools you're going to get in the packet from today when you sign up and get the tools, the 11 tools, one of them is this board fundraising worksheet where I lay out the 10 most regular and easy lifts for a board. So in there, it breaks out, okay, maybe I'm expected to raise $2,000 this year or $20,000, whatever it is. Here are the 10 things I'm going to do this year to help reach that. I can run a Facebook fundraiser, which requires zero money. I can invite people to donate things to our silent auction. There's all sorts of things in that board fundraising worksheet. So when you get it, look at it. If you want additional tips, feel free to hit reply on the email that you'll get, and I can try to give you additional tips. But one of the best ways to get your board in the local community, a rural community, or where there's not a lot of resources to fundraise is by giving them suggestions and ideas. You don't need to be rich, and you don't even need to have rich friends to be able to hit these goals. There are so many tools now, especially with Facebook fundraisers, where you can use the power of your network and your networks to raise money.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sean. So just to wrap up, I'd like to say thank you so much to Sean and our partners at our 7 different funding information network locations for participating today. And on behalf of our team and our presenter, thank you for joining us today. If you like this webinar, we hope that you'll join us again soon. And I'd like to say thank you all so much for your time. And thank you again, Sean. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.